friends! My name is Antoinette Chanel and welcome back to my channel. I want to start today's video by talking to you about Janet Jackson because she is the queen of my universe. Now, I realize that she's not everybody's favorite. That's fine, but she's my favorite and that's why I'm talking about her. I've been dancing like her since I was 5. I know several of her albums frontwards and backwards like they're the back of my hand. I've seen her in concert twice. Like, I'm a huge fan of Janet. In my mind, she and I get along perfectly and we like all of the same things because she's also a Taurus like I am, which of course that would just be so perfect, right? But Janet Jackson isn't my friend. Sadly. Janet Jackson is a celebrity that I have enjoyed watching and listening to. I have consumed her art. I have supported her efforts over the years, but she and I are not friends, and my monetary consumption of her work and support of her work doesn't make us friends either. But quite simply, I am a fan of hers. My assumption to know her likes and her dislikes is indicative that I have and this is actually hypothetical for the sake of this video because I don't really do this, but if I was to assume that I know exactly what she likes and she dislikes, that would be indicative of a parasocial relationship that I'm engaging in with her. Parasocial relationships are one-sided connections that consumers form with notable people, whether they be athletes or celebrities or politicians or sometimes even fictional characters. And the parasocial relationship is often demonstrated by the fact that these consumers are investing in some way into this personality, this figurehead, whether that be with their time, their viewership, their listenership, their money, so purchasing whatever this person is selling, supporting their projects, going to their movies, buying their albums, whatever that looks like, donating to organizations that they either head up or support. And so the most basic form of what a parasocial relationship looks like is someone who maybe forms a crush with somebody that they see in a movie or in a music group, or they're an artist, or maybe they're an influencer of some kind, but you know, they form these sort of butterfly feelings over them, and then they purchase their posters, or they might have their this person's picture as like the background on their phone or something like that. And so in that way, they are serious in their devotion and their admiration of this person, but it's not anything that is dangerous. So they're not posing any sort of threat to this figure that they look up to or to anybody else who might look up to that person or oppose them. They just simply have a crush. They are a fan. They are enthusiastic about this person. But that's not usually where parasocial relationships stop. So the extreme form of this is the formation of stan communities. If you don't know what a stan community is, you can think about stans as being fans, but like to a different level. And I guess I probably should have looked up like, where did that term come from? Let me see if I can find it. Okay, so I had a hunch that this is where it came from, but I didn't know for sure. But according to the Googles, the reason why we call them stans is actually named after that song by Eminem from 2000 by Stan, where he has this like obsessive fan who basically writes him all these letters and ends up, I think, killing his wife and then committing the S word. But there was a collaboration between Eminem and Dido for this song that made that song really huge. It also really helped to launch Dido's career at the time. Like, she had launched her career, but she wasn't as mainstream as she became after she worked with Eminem. Anyway, that character in that song and in that music video is named Stan. He's this obsessive person who is just head over heels for Eminem. And I guess that's where we got the term from. But yeah, I think of stans as being fans on steroids, and that's often where I think of the ST is coming from. But back to parasocial relationships. Stan communities really do form around the fierce celebration of and protection of these figureheads. And what's interesting about stans in current times, as I record this in 2025, is that we're seeing political stans come to the forefront a lot more. I don't think political standing is anything new. I mean, calling it standing is something that's more modern, but I don't think that this is something that just came about in the 2020s or even the 2000s. I think that this was always a thing because when I look back at history, I was very young when Ronald Reagan was president, but when I look back at the coverage of Reagan, the legacy of Reagan, it kind of seems like he was a political figure who had stans. And it's important that we acknowledge that parasocial relationships do form with politicians. So with the people who are supposed to be representing the people, representing the interests of the common man, or, the person on the ground, somebody who is far removed from Washington, D.C. and the government proper. Those people have stands that also will form around them. Not all of them do, but several of them do. And the presence of stand communities within politics specifically, I think, is a really great place to look at how parasocial relationships can actually work in two directions. Like, it goes back and forth. The consumers can have a parasocial relationship that they form with the figurehead because they admire them, because they think the best of them, because they just staunchly support whatever this person does. But also, we see politicians especially who assume that their voter base might act or think in a certain way, and they get very surprised when they don't. There are politicians acting right now who assume that they will get blind support from their voter base, and I think that assumption is evidence of the fact that so many of them are just out of touch. They don't have a clear sense of connection with the people who they are supposed to be representing. But that's a different video. Back to parasocial relationships. Beyonce and the Beehive are a quintessential example of what standing looks like in popular culture and entertainment. And they also are a really good case study of what stan communities can do for perception of a figurehead, and also coverage of that figurehead, and sort of the way that we write the story about that figurehead. Stan communities will often have sharp public responses to anything that they perceive to be a slight against whoever their beloved figure might be. And while that alone in isolation might not seem like that big of a deal, I would say that coverage of Beyonce has been largely swayed by the presence of her beehive. So being critical of Beyonce is something that gets joked about as like, oh no, you don't want to do that. But in actuality, there has been less critical coverage of Beyonce publicly because of the presence of the stan community. No, I know that they haven't been able to eradicate all critical coverage of Beyonce, but there is a lot of critical coverage of Beyonce that does not make it to mainstream, doesn't make it to the public, and I think it's because a lot of people are fearful of the stan community coming for them. There was an example a few years ago where there's a woman, her business, her wedding planning business was called Blue Ivy. And Beyonce was trying to copyright the name Blue Ivy for obvious reasons. And this woman, who is just a regular person, she's out here with her business, making her living, taking care of herself, just like the rest of us human adults are supposed to be doing, was taking on Beyonce in this sort of legal head-to-head battle. And it ended up turning into a really nasty social media clash where a lot of the stans within the Beehive were spamming this woman's social media accounts with just tons of bees and lemon emojis everywhere. I would imagine that for anybody working in this woman's business, it was probably so alarming, as well as just insanely disruptive having to deal with what the Beehive was inflicting on this poor business, simply because she happened to also be using the name Blue Ivy, which was completely out of coincidence. I don't think this woman picked the name Blue Ivy because she was trying to take something from Beyonce. I mean, even looking back at the records, she established her business before Blue Ivy Carter was born. She just didn't copyright it. And I know a lot of people have things to say about that, about like, oh, you should have been copywriting this. A lot of people sit at the keyboard and talk about all of the different ways that they would have insured their business and protected their customers, this, that, and the third. The majority of people who are speaking like that on the internet don't know what they're talking about. But that's just one example of how the presence of a stan community can create really nasty implications on people who seemingly don't even have anything to do with the figurehead that the stan community supports. It's simply that fierce loyalty, that fierce protection of their leader, and that is what motivates the behavior, and that is problematic. Regular people are not afforded the luxury of having hundreds of thousands of people spread across the globe who will instantaneously jump to their defense whenever anyone is trying to say anything that is critical of them. We just don't have that as regular people. It's a privilege that people like Beyonce and others get to have. And so that also brings up the question of how much responsibility does the figurehead have when they have the presence of these stan communities and these parasocial relationships? How much of the onus is on the figurehead, the celebrity, the athlete, the politician, to put an end to that versus the oftentimes adult people who are members of the community engaging in that behavior willfully, who should know better? That's the argument anyway, that they should know better. And I have a couple of theories about that I'll get to in a minute. Psychologically, parasocial relationships can be damaging because the public and people are often led to these conclusions about celebrities and figureheads that aren't necessary, aren't reasonable, or just simply aren't true. We have no way of knowing that these things are true. So in that way, there's this sort of halo bias that gets attached by stan communities to their figurehead because they want to believe the best of that person. They want to believe that this person is very considerate and loving and would never hurt a fly and would never utter anything that is bigoted or racist or discriminatory or ableist or colorist or any of the things, you know? We want to believe that these people are voting in our best interest because, you know, we have so much in common with them. But is that true? Is that even realistic? I would say no, but we still engage in it largely as a collective population, and that part's kind of funny. It's almost like we are willfully signing up for the dissonance, and I don't feel like people point that part out nearly as much as we need to. To assume that a celebrity that you like is going to be just as compassionate about the same issues you're compassionate about. They're going to vote in the same ways and carry the same politics as you, even though their tax bracket is probably much different from yours and their concerns are much different from yours. That assumption is, well, at its most basic level, very naive, but on a larger level, really, really scary. This is the stuff that people base their arguments on in comment sections. This is the kind of mudslinging that goes back and forth on Twitter, X, whatever they're calling it. You know, that's what this is born from, is these assumptions that we just know that she could never say that, he would never do that, they would never want that. Like, we don't actually know that. It's nice to believe that celebrities are compassionate to the poor. You know, we might see them donating from time to time and think, okay, that's gotta be proof that they're compassionate for the poor. They have compassion for the poor. But unless we speak to them and hear them say that out of their own mouths, and not on a television screen or on a phone, but actually sit down with that person face to face and ask them ourselves. And even then, they could still be lying to us when they're talking to us right there in front of us, like humans lie. Unless you have some sort of guarantee from the horse's mouth, figuratively, you don't know. And so all of this speculation about what sorts of things are important to Taylor Swift, or what sorts of passions make Barack Obama, you know, motivated to want to act, or, you know, what sorts of things make Donald Trump just very passionate and motivated for his voter base. You know, unless we actually speak to those people, we have no way of telling that, and we're just making a lot of assumptions about them, assumptions that can cost us. Even in death, we see that parasocial relationships can be risky, scary, just lots of risky ambiguity around them, as people speculate about Michael Jackson constantly. Love him or hate him, he's not here to actually defend himself. So all of these exposés and new court cases and things that have cropped up that are claiming that, oh, he was so awful, but then some people say he was so harmless and wonderful, and then other people say he was so manipulative, and then other people say, you just didn't know him the way that I did. He's not here. Let the man rest. Changing a legacy after a person has died seems cruel, but you know, that's just me. But pulling back from the extreme of stan communities, parasocial relationships can also be really harmful for us on a level that is out in the open, but isn't being talked about nearly as much. We have a lot of people who are looking to celebrities and influencers and politicians and these other sorts of figureheads that we've been talking about this whole time for very serious financial and medical and spiritual advice. And what we're seeing over and over again is that these people who were never ever qualified to give such advice, to be such leaders in these areas, are then being hit with scrutiny because the people who were looking up to them and taking their advice find themselves in financial ruin, find themselves facing a lot of challenges, more than they would have had if they had just stuck to maybe the advice of an actual guru, somebody who has worked in the field and who has some credentials to their name. And so there's this sort of scammer pipeline that gets formed with parasocial relationships where a lot of times I see this with influencers who are selling this dream to the people who follow them about, this is the way that you lose the weight and keep it off. This is the way that you get rich and stay rich so you never have financial worries ever again. This is the way that you change your life and get all of the things that you want. You know, very pie in the sky and vague sorts of promises, but that sound very good, especially to people who already like you and already support you and, you know, want to follow what you are saying. I said influencers, but podcasters and live streamers, you know, I kind of group them all into the same sort of category of, these are figureheads who are very accessible in that me or you could become one of them tomorrow if we just went viral with something. They're accessible in that way, but they still carry the same type of responsibility that we would assign to somebody like a J-Lo or a Justin Bieber. But I don't know that those people necessarily realize it yet, because people like J-Lo and Justin Bieber and others have gone through that sort of celebrity indoctrination that happens where, you know, you work with an agent, you go to celebrity events and industry type parties where you learn insider information and sort of get the gist that way. Whereas influencers can go from being nobody to literally somebody who's big and everybody's looking at them overnight with no training whatsoever. They're just kind of expected to come out here and know how to do PR, know how to interview, know how to, you know how to speak to crowds in ways that are responsible, all of that. So the incel trad wife trend is a really good example of this, because we have these sorts of influencers in the incel space who are giving out all of this advice about how to get women, how to be happy, how to get rich, how to become more masculine and be the alpha dog, etc., etc. But very little of what is being dispensed in those spaces is actually equating to real results for the people who are signing up for these masterminds, signing up for these classes and, you know, these discords that you got to pay 4 figures just to get access to. And then it's just a bunch of videos from random people who there's no real proof that these people are successful. They're just attached to a name like an Andrew Tate or Aiden Ross, that's his name. The trad wife trend right now is selling this idea that this selfless servitude is leading to this life of fulfillment for women. And it might be for some women, but I would say that the women who are finding just true, utter, overjoyed happiness in the trad wife trend, they are exceptions. They are not the rule. Most women who sign up for the trad wife life often come to the realization way too late that, oh my gosh, I'm sort of trapped here in this situation where I don't work, my husband makes all of the money, and I'm pretty much just used as a domesticator who also is giving birth to babies, you know, intermittently, assuming that she is able to get pregnant and therefore does get pregnant. Most of the trad wives I've seen on social media, they are either pregnant or they have very small new babies that they've just given birth to. You know, so it looks really glamorous when you're on Instagram or TikTok and they're in these beautiful kitchens and they're wearing their cute aprons and they have their beautiful done up faces and hair and their dresses and whatnot, and the baby is so cute. But the reality of what makes that moment is the sleepless night where the baby just did not want to go down and was really fussy, and you know, the difficulties with nursing and figuring out what kind of formula are we going to choose, and diapers have gone up in price, and the spouse not being around to support very much because he's working all of the time. Those are the kinds of things I don't hear people talking about that are very real realities with just marriage in general and being a wife, and are doubly, triply, exponentially going to be true if you're a trad wife. The self-help space is another one where we see a lot of parasocial relationships being formed with these gurus, these people who have figured out what the trick is. You Rachel Hollis and Dave Hollis come to mind with this because they were a couple who were selling marriage retreats and marriage and couple counseling, even though neither one of them are counselors, neither one of them have a degree in psychology, neither one of them's trained in any of this. And it came out later that while they were charging people upwards of $1,800 to come to their marriage retreats, the two of them were actually suffering behind the scenes. Their marriage was on life support. I will probably also talk more about Dave Hollis in the future because I want to cover the self-help space and the sort of dangerous pipeline that I see forming between failed influencers and celebrities kind of going into the self-help space and grifting and therefore misleading hordes of people in the process. And Dave was one of those people who I saw doing that. And the very unfortunate part is that Dave is now no longer with us, primarily because he was trying to keep up with a lifestyle and an image that was never sustainable and it was never for him. So in conclusion, parasocial relationships happen often and they aren't always bad. So this idea of selling merchandise such as posters or, school supplies that maybe have the face of a very popular young character on it, those types of things play into the harmless nature of parasocial relationships, and I'm sure that all of us have engaged in those at some point or another. If you downloaded a picture of your celebrity crush and saved it onto your phone, or you had a poster of them on your wall, you engaged in this too. It's not that big of a deal. I've been framing this as something as like a heterosexual type of a crush, but this can also be same-sex and it can also be just fans of people. So dudes who have basketball posters of their favorite player, same thing. That's a parasocial relationship that's forming, but it's a harmless one. In some contexts, I would even argue that parasocial relationships can be positive. And so in one way, how parasocial relationships inspire people and, motivate them to try something that they are seeing somebody else doing, that brings forth new talent. You look at someone like Whitney Houston and Brandy Norwood as a good example for this, because Brandy saw Whitney singing on television and decided that she wanted to be like her. That was what she was aspiring towards. Whitney's motivation of Brandy also brought us that beautiful Cinderella movie that was on, I think it was ABC, put it on television, where Brandy starred as Cinderella, Whitney starred as the fairy godmother, and the two of them just had such great on-screen chemistry. And that was the manifestation of what would become, it actually was already, but what went on to be a great mentorship relationship between Whitney and Brandy. And I know I'm grateful for that as someone who grew up in the 90s and loved both of those women for their artistry. But as we've talked about, parasocial relationships do also come with their downfalls, their pitfalls, their drawbacks. A lot of people don't realize that they have been manipulated into certain ideologies or certain mindsets or opinions because of parasocial relationships. Taylor Swift has a raging fan base right now, but Taylor Swift's fans, the fanatical ones, the stans, they've been manipulated into thinking that Taylor is an angel, and she's not any more than anybody else out here in the world. She's a human just like everyone. And so when something goes awry for this beloved figurehead, this athlete, this celebrity, that's usually when the people who are in the parasocial relationship have that rude awakening where the veil is pulled off of their eyes and they're forced to see that maybe this celebrity or this person who I've been looking up to doesn't think exactly the way that I thought they do. Maybe their opinions are not as rosy as I thought they were. Maybe I have been looking at them and assuming them to be much better and much greater than they actually are. I don't see very many instances of celebrities, notable figureheads taking responsibility for the parasocial relationships that get formed between them and their fan bases, and that part seems a little disingenuous. I think that there is some onus if you have a following, an audience, to be responsible with how you lead that audience, even if you're not really trying to be a leader necessarily. But I think that if you see your fan base doing something that is abhorrent, it's your job to call that out. Be socially responsible. I think you also have to call yourself out and say, hey, I engaged in something that was irresponsible, or I misled you by telling you that this company or this person who I was affiliating with was safe and not a scam and, not something that would harm my audience. But above everything, when it comes to consumerism, having celebrities running about and commingling in a lot of different fields, including politics, it's very important that each of us as consumers just has a basic level of media literacy, which means practicing critical thinking first and foremost, questioning headlines, and also looking for source material that could back up whatever the claims are. It's a good idea to question everything all the time, yes, but that doesn't mean that you have to assume that everything that's out here is a lie and everyone is trying to get you. Just do some basic research to see, okay, what's actually happening here? That's critical thinking. Taking some healthy breaks from media consumption is also good for media literacy and just maintaining a healthy sense of reality with what's going on with the world. Having a healthy sense of self-awareness is also good for media literacy. So recognizing where your biases will come in, because we all have them, and knowing how to check them or at least circumvent them so that you can try to be as neutral as possible, that's always going to serve you well. Okay, my friends, that's all I have for this video. Thank you so much for watching to the end. I really appreciate you being here. I hope that if you enjoyed this video, you will give it a like. You will also subscribe to this channel so that you don't miss any of my future videos. You can follow me on Instagram. There's my handle down there. Otherwise, I'll be talking to you again soon. Take care, my friends.